The metal felt cold against my chest as I stood in that sterile Pentagon briefing room, watching my brother Marcus squirm in his chair. 3 years ago, he'd called me pathetic in front of everyone at his police academy graduation. Today, he was about to find out exactly who I really was. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Growing up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Marcus and I were inseparable. Our father, Robert Thompson, worked double shifts at the John Deere plant while our mother, Patricia, managed the night shift at Mercy Hospital. Money was always tight, but our parents made sure we understood the value of hard work and dedication. Marcus was everything parents dreamed of in a son. 3 years older than me, he excelled at everything he touched. Star quarterback at Washington High School, honor roll student, and the kind of kid who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries without being asked. Teachers loved him, girls swooned over him, and coaches from 3 different colleges offered him scholarships. I was different. Quieter. While Marcus commanded attention in every room he entered, I preferred the shadow. I spent hours reading military history books, studying tactical maneuvers, and analyzing battlefield strategies. My bedroom walls were covered with maps of famous campaigns rather than sports posters. Where Marcus thrived on applause and recognition, I found satisfaction in understanding how complex systems worked together. The differences between us became more apparent as we grew older. Marcus chose the obvious path: full ride to the University of Iowa for football, then straight into the police academy. Everyone expected great things from him, and he delivered. Meanwhile, I struggled through community college, working part-time jobs to pay for classes that didn't seem to lead anywhere specific. Our parents tried not to show favoritism, but it was impossible to miss. Marcus's achievements filled our kitchen walls: newspaper clippings of his touchdown passes, his graduation photo in his crisp police uniform, commendations from his precinct. My accomplishments were smaller, quieter, and often went unnoticed by everyone except myself. The tension between us started building during my second year at Kirkwood Community College. I'd been accepted to several 4-year universities, but the financial burden would have been crushing for our family. Marcus, already established in his career, couldn't understand why I didn't just pick something and stick with it like he had. He saw my uncertainty as weakness, my thoughtful approach as indecision. "You're 20 years old, Daniel," he said one Thanksgiving dinner, his voice carrying that edge of frustration that had become familiar. "When are you going to stop drifting and actually do something with your life?" Our father looked uncomfortable, pushing green beans around his plate. Our mother tried to change the subject, but Marcus wasn't finished. I had my career mapped out by the time I was 18. College, police academy, detective track. It's not that complicated. I wanted to explain that some of us needed more time to figure out our path, that not everyone could see their future as clearly as he could. Instead, I just nodded and finished my meal in silence. The breaking point came during my junior year. I'd finally found my direction: military service followed by a career in intelligence analysis. I'd been meeting with Army recruiters, taking practice tests, and researching different military occupational specialties. For the first time in years, I felt excited about my future. But when I told Marcus about my plans, his reaction wasn't what I expected. "The military?" he laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. "Daniel, you can barely handle college coursework. You think you can survive basic training. Boot camp isn't like those history books you read." His words stung because they echoed my own deepest fears. I'd always been more intellectual than physical, more comfortable with strategy than action. The thought of military training intimidated me, but I also knew it was exactly what I needed to grow into the person I wanted to become. "I've been preparing," I said quietly. "I've been working out, studying, talking to recruiters about different programs." Marcus shook his head. "You're setting yourself up for failure. Why don't you look into something more realistic? Maybe technical school, learn a trade. There's good money in plumbing or electrical work." The suggestion wasn't meant to be insulting, but it felt like he was trying to fit me into a smaller box, to keep me in the role of the little brother who couldn't quite measure up to his standard. I enlisted 3 months later without telling anyone in my family. The decision wasn't made in anger or rebellion, it came from a deep certainty that this was my path, regardless of what anyone else thought. I completed my paperwork, took my oath, and only informed my parents the night before I left for basic training. The conversation didn't go well. Our parents were shocked and worried, but ultimately supportive. Marcus was furious. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, pacing around our living room. "You make these impulsive decisions without thinking them through. What happens when you wash out? What's your backup plan?" "I won't wash out," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "How can you be so sure? You've never stuck with anything difficult before." That accusation hung in the air between us. In Marcus's mind, I was still the uncertain college student who couldn't commit to a major. He couldn't see that my seeming indecision had actually been careful consideration, that I'd been searching for something worth committing to completely. The morning I left for Fort Benning, Marcus didn't come to say goodbye. He was working an overnight shift, he said, but I suspected he was avoiding the emotional scene. Our parents drove me to the airport, both trying not to cry, both proud and terrified in equal measure. Basic training was everything I'd expected and nothing like I'd imagined. The physical challenges pushed me beyond limits I didn't know I had. The mental pressure broke down walls I'd built around my self-doubt. Most importantly, I discovered that my analytical nature wasn't a weakness in this environment. It was an asset. While other recruits struggled with the complexity of military protocols and procedures, I thrived. I understood how individual actions connected to larger objectives. I could see patterns in training exercises that helped my unit perform better. Drill sergeants who initially viewed my quiet demeanor as lack of confidence began to recognize it as focused concentration. During week 8 of basic training, I received a letter from Marcus. It was brief and formal, congratulating me on making it halfway through and expressing hope that I was finding what I was looking for. There was no warmth in the words, no real encouragement, but it was communication, which felt like progress. I wrote back, describing some of the leadership challenges we faced during field exercises, explaining how military training was teaching me to think differently about problem-solving and teamwork. I thought he might appreciate the parallels to police work, the shared values of service and discipline. His response was even shorter. "Glad you're staying busy. Mom and Dad are proud." After basic training came advanced individual training, where I specialized in intelligence analysis. This was where everything clicked for me. All those hours I'd spent studying historical battles and tactical decisions suddenly had practical application. I was learning to gather information, identify patterns, and provide actionable intelligence to decision-makers. My instructors noticed my aptitude immediately. I consistently scored in the top percentile on examinations, and my analytical reports were often used as examples for other students. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just keeping up, I was excelling beyond everyone's expectations, including my own. But success in training was just the beginning. The real test would come with my first assignment, and the challenges that would ultimately lead me back to that Pentagon briefing room, watching my brother realize that the pathetic little brother he'd dismissed had become something he never could have imagined. My first deployment took me to a joint intelligence facility in Germany, where I worked alongside analysts from multiple branches and allied nations. The base at Ramstein was unlike anything I'd experienced, a hub of global operations, where information flowed in from every corner of the world, and critical decisions were made around the clock. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell ran our unit with precision that would have impressed a Swiss watchmaker. She was a career intelligence officer who'd worked her way up through assignments in Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Within my first week, she called me into her office. "Thompson, your test scores and training evaluations are impressive, but this isn't school anymore. Here, lives depend on the accuracy and speed of your analysis. Are you ready for that responsibility?" I assured her I was, but honestly I felt overwhelmed. The intelligence we processed wasn't theoretical. It involved real operations, real soldiers, real consequences. My first major assignment involved tracking weapons shipments through Eastern European networks that supplied insurgent groups in 3 different conflict zones. The work required me to synthesize information from satellite imagery, intercepted communications, financial records, and human intelligence reports. I spent 16-hour days building patterns, creating link analyses, and developing predictive models about where these weapons would surface next. 3 weeks into the assignment, I identified a critical connection that other analysts had missed. A seemingly legitimate shipping company in Bulgaria was actually a front operation, and I'd traced their cargo manifests to pinpoint when and where a major weapons transfer would occur. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell reviewed my findings with her typical stern expression. After 20 minutes of questioning every assumption and data point, she nodded once. "Good work, Thompson. This intelligence is going straight to operational command." 2 days later, a joint task force intercepted the weapons shipment exactly where my analysis predicted. 43 assault rifles, 12 rocket-propelled grenades, and enough ammunition to supply a small army were kept out of terrorist hands. It was my first real victory, and it felt better than any academic achievement I'd ever earned. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Meanwhile, back in Cedar Rapids, Marcus was building his own career. Through phone calls with our parents, I learned he'd made detective ahead of schedule and was working major crimes investigations. He'd also gotten engaged to Jennifer Walsh, a kindergarten teacher he'd met at a community fundraiser. Their wedding was scheduled for the following summer. During my first leave, I flew home expecting things might be different between us. I'd proven myself in ways that should have mattered to someone in law enforcement. I had stories about international cooperation, successful operations, and growing responsibilities that paralleled his own career advancement. But our reunion was awkward and strained. Marcus seemed uncomfortable when I talked about my work, often changing the subject or making jokes about desk jobs and computer warriors. When I mentioned the weapons interdiction success, he shrugged it off. "That's great, Daniel, but it's not exactly street work, is it? You're still behind a screen while other people do the dangerous stuff." His comment revealed something I hadn't fully understood before. Marcus needed to see himself as the one taking real risks, facing real danger. My work, no matter how critical, threatened that self-image, because it suggested that intelligence and analysis could be as valuable as physical courage and direct action. The visit home also showed me how much I'd changed. Military life had given me confidence and purpose that my family hadn't seen before. I carried myself differently, spoke with more authority, and approached problems with systematic thinking that came from professional training. Our parents noticed the transformation and were proud, but Marcus seemed threatened by it. "You've gotten pretty serious," he said, one evening as we sat on our parents' back porch. "Remember when you used to laugh at things?" "I still laugh," I replied. "Just maybe not at the same things I used to." "Yeah, well, don't forget where you came from. All that military stuff is fine, but at the end of the day you're still little Daniel from Cedar Rapids." The comment was meant to be brotherly teasing, but it carried an edge. Marcus was trying to keep me in the box he'd always known, to prevent me from outgrowing the role of younger brother who needed his guidance and approval. When I returned to Germany, I threw myself into work with renewed focus. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell had been promoted, and her replacement, Major Brian Rodriguez, brought different challenges and opportunities. He was younger than Mitchell, a former special operations officer who understood the value of intelligence in supporting direct action missions. "Thompson," he said during our first unit meeting, "I've reviewed your file, you have potential, but potential doesn't mean much if you're content staying in the analysis pool forever. I'm recommending you for the Advanced Intelligence course." The Advanced Intelligence course was a 6-month program that prepared officers for senior analytical positions and leadership roles. It was highly competitive, and selection meant the Army saw me as someone worth investing in for the long term. The course took place at Fort Huachuca in Arizona, where I studied alongside some of the brightest intelligence professionals in the military. We learned advanced analytical techniques, studied case histories of successful and failed intelligence operations, and participated in simulations that tested our ability to make critical decisions under pressure. More importantly, the course introduced me to the world of special operations intelligence. I learned about units I'd only heard whispered about, groups that operated in the shadows, conducting missions that would never make the news. The instructors, many of whom had served in these elite units, began to see something in me that I was only beginning to recognize in myself. Captain Lisa Hayes pulled me aside after a particularly challenging exercise where I'd successfully coordinated intelligence support for a simulated hostage rescue mission. "Thompson, have you considered applying for selection to special operations units? Your analytical skills are exceptional. But more than that, you think like an operator. You understand how intelligence translates to action." The suggestion was flattering but intimidating. Special operations meant a completely different level of commitment, training, and risk. It also meant potentially years without seeing my family, working on classified missions that I could never discuss with anyone outside the community. But it also represented the ultimate validation of everything I'd been working toward. The quiet kid who'd been dismissed as indecisive and impractical was being recruited for some of the most demanding and important work in the military. I spent weeks considering the opportunity. The application process alone was daunting. Psychological evaluations, extensive background investigations, and endorsements from senior officers. If accepted, I'd face months of additional training that would push me far beyond anything I'd experienced so far. The decision became clear during a video call with my parents. They were excited about Marcus's upcoming wedding and his recent promotion to detective sergeant. In the middle of our conversation, Marcus grabbed the phone. "Hey, little brother. Still playing with computers over there." His tone was joking, but the dismissiveness was real. Even after everything I'd accomplished, he still saw my work as somehow less significant than his own. In that moment, I realized I was tired of seeking his approval and ready to pursue excellence on my own terms. "Actually, Marcus, I'm applying for some specialized training that might lead to different opportunities." "More school, Daniel? At some point you have to stop preparing and start doing." If only he knew what I was actually preparing for. The irony was that Marcus, who prided himself on taking action and facing danger, would never qualify for the kind of work I was being considered for. His personality, while perfect for police work, lacked the subtle analytical thinking and emotional control required for special operations intelligence. I submitted my application the next day, knowing that it represented a point of no return. Whatever happened next would take me further from the life Marcus understood and closer to becoming someone he couldn't categorize or dismiss. The selection process would test everything I'd learned about myself and everything I thought I was capable of becoming. More importantly, it would set in motion the chain of events that would eventually bring me face to face with my brother in that Pentagon briefing room, when he would finally understand exactly who I'd become. The special operations selection process began with a psychological evaluation that lasted 3 days. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a civilian contractor who'd spent decades assessing candidates for classified programs, put me through tests I hadn't known existed. She measured not just intelligence and emotional stability, but psychological resilience, moral flexibility, and what she called cognitive compartmentalization. "Mr. Thompson," she said during our final session, "you possess an unusual combination of analytical detachment and emotional investment. Most people lean heavily toward one or the other. The question is whether you can maintain both qualities under extreme stress." I thought I understood what she meant, but the real test came during the physical and mental challenges that followed. Selection took place at an undisclosed location in Virginia, where 23 candidates from different military branches competed for 8 positions in a program we were told simply as advanced intelligence operations. The first week eliminated half the candidates through a combination of physical endurance tests, sleep deprivation, and complex problem-solving scenarios. Unlike basic training, where success depended on following orders precisely, these exercises rewarded creative thinking and adaptability. Candidates who excelled at traditional military skills often struggled when faced with ambiguous situations that had no clear right answer. I found my rhythm during a 72-hour exercise where we were given incomplete intelligence about a simulated terrorist cell and tasked with developing actionable plans to neutralize the threat. While other candidates focused on direct action approaches, I spent hours analyzing communication patterns, financial networks, and behavioral indicators to identify the cell's true objectives and vulnerabilities. My solution involved disrupting their funding sources and turning one member into an unwitting double agent rather than conducting a raid that might scatter the organization. The instructors were impressed not just with the strategy, but with my ability to present it coherently after 3 days without sleep. Major Patricia Williams, the senior instructor, called me aside after that exercise. "Thompson, you think differently than most people. That's valuable, but it can also be isolating. The units you're being considered for require individuals who can work alone for extended periods while maintaining absolute commitment to the mission. Are you prepared for that level of isolation?" I assured her I was, but honestly, I was beginning to understand the price of the path I'd chosen. The more specialized my training became, the fewer people could understand the work I was doing. The gap between my experiences and those of civilians, including my family, was widening every day. During our single weekend break, I called home and learned that Marcus's wedding plans were accelerating. Jennifer was pregnant, and they'd moved the ceremony up to accommodate her condition. Our mother was thrilled about becoming a grandmother, and even our usually reserved father was excited about the expanding family. "Daniel, you have to get leave for the wedding." Our mother insisted. "Marcus specifically asked about your availability." The request surprised me. Marcus had shown little interest in my military career, and I'd assumed he'd be content having the ceremony without his problematic younger brother potentially drawing attention from his big day. "When is it scheduled?" 3 weeks from Saturday. I know it's short notice, but with the baby coming, 3 weeks from Saturday was exactly when selection was scheduled to end. The final phase involved a comprehensive evaluation that would determine not just whether candidates passed, but what specific roles they'd be assigned within the special operations community. Missing it wasn't an option. "Mom, I can't get leave during training. This is really important for my career." "More important than your brother's wedding?" The question hung in the air, and I realized there was no answer that would satisfy everyone. To my family, missing Marcus's wedding seemed like another example of my poor priorities and lack of commitment to family relationship. To the instructors evaluating me, requesting leave during selection would demonstrate exactly the kind of divided loyalty that disqualified candidates from classified work. "I'll see what I can do," I said, knowing I wouldn't even ask. The final week of selection pushed candidates beyond anything we'd experienced. We were isolated in individual cells for 48 hours with nothing but basic rations and water, then subjected to interrogation techniques designed to test our resistance to psychological pressure. The interrogators used personal information from our background investigations to create scenarios that felt disturbingly real. "Your brother thinks you're weak," one interrogator said, during a particularly intense session. "He told investigators that you've never finished anything you started, that you're probably looking for an easy way out of the military like you did with college." I knew the statements weren't real. Marcus had never been interviewed by military investigators, but the words stung because they reflected fears I'd carried for years. The interrogator was skilled at finding psychological vulnerabilities and exploiting them under stress. "Your family doesn't understand what you're doing here," he continued. "They think you're wasting your potential on some fantasy about being important. When this doesn't work out, you'll go home to a brother who's built a real career and a real family while you've been playing soldier." The session lasted 6 hours, but it felt like days. By the end, I was exhausted, frustrated, and questioning my own motivations. But I also discovered something important about myself. The doubts and criticisms that had once paralyzed me now felt external, like background noise that didn't affect my core sense of purpose. When the interrogation ended, I felt clearer about my path than ever before. My family's approval, while important to me emotionally, wasn't necessary for my success. Marcus's opinion of my choices mattered less than my own commitment to the work I was doing. The final evaluation took place in a secure conference room where 3 senior officers reviewed each candidate's performance throughout the selection process. Colonel James Fletcher, a career special operations officer, led the panel. "Thompson, your analytical abilities are exceptional, and your performance under stress has been consistently strong. However, we have concerns about your emotional investment in family approval. Special operations personnel often face situations where personal relationships must be secondary to mission requirements. Can you handle that level of compartmentalization?" "Yes, sir. I understand that the work comes first. Even if it means missing significant family events. Even if it means maintaining cover stories that prevent you from sharing achievements with people you care about." I thought about Marcus's wedding, about the disappointment in my mother's voice, about the growing distance between my experiences and my family's understanding. "Yes, sir. I accept those requirements." Colonel Fletcher made notes in my file, then looked up something that might have been approved. "Thompson, you've been selected for advanced training in strategic intelligence operations. Your first assignment will involve deep cover work in an urban environment, gathering intelligence on domestic security threats. The training will last 8 months, and upon completion, you'll be assigned to a classified unit that reports directly to Joint Special Operations Command." The words felt surreal. Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, was the military's most elite counter-terrorism organization. I would be working alongside operators whose names never appeared in newspapers, on missions that officially didn't exist. "This assignment requires absolute secrecy," Colonel Fletcher continued. "Your family, including your parents, cannot know the nature of your work. Your official records will show assignment to routine intelligence duties. Any breach of operational security will result in immediate termination and possible criminal charges." I understood the implications. I would be entering a world where my achievements would be invisible, where the work that mattered most could never be acknowledged publicly. Marcus would continue seeing me as his underachieving younger brother, never knowing that I'd become part of the most elite intelligence community in the world. The irony was perfect. In pursuing recognition and respect, I'd earned a position that required complete anonymity. The validation I'd sought from my family was now impossible to obtain without compromising everything I'd worked for. As I left the briefing, I realized that the boy who'd needed his brother's approval was gone forever. What remained was a professional who understood that some achievements were their own reward, regardless of whether anyone else recognized them. 8 months of advanced training at a facility that didn't officially exist transformed me into someone I barely recognized. The Daniel Thompson who'd struggled with confidence in college was gone, replaced by someone who could assume false identities, speak 3 languages fluently, and analyze threats that most people couldn't imagine. My first deep cover assignment placed me in Seattle, operating under the identity of Michael Stevens, a freelance cybersecurity consultant. My mission was to infiltrate a network of domestic extremists who'd been recruiting military veterans for anti-government activities. The operation required me to build relationships over months, gaining trust while documenting their plans and identifying their leadership structure. The apartment the agency provided was sparse but functional, exactly what someone in my cover identity could afford. I spent weeks studying Michael Stevens's fabricated history, practicing his mannerisms, and developing the technical expertise that would make my cover story believable. Every morning, I woke up as Michael Daniel Thompson existed only in classified files and secure communications with my handler. Agent Carol Martinez was my primary contact, a veteran operative who'd run similar operations for over a decade. We met monthly at rotating locations, usually coffee shops or bookstores where a casual conversation wouldn't draw attention. "The target group is more sophisticated than previous cells we've monitored," she explained during our 3rd meeting. "They're using military-grade encryption, compartmented communication protocols, and they're extremely paranoid about infiltration." My entry point came through Jake Harrison, a former Army sergeant who'd been discharged for disciplinary issues and now ran a military surplus store. Through carefully planned encounters, I established myself as someone disillusioned with government policies and interested in connecting with like-minded veterans. The process was painstakingly slow, Harrison tested me for weeks with increasingly provocative conversations about government overreach and constitutional violations. I had to balance showing enough anti-establishment sentiment to gain his trust while avoiding saying anything that might actually encourage illegal activity. "The system's rigged against people like us," he said one evening, as we shared beers after his store closed. "Military guys who serve their country get treated like potential threats while real criminals walk free. I've seen enough government incompetence to last a lifetime," I agreed, drawing on genuine frustrations from my pre-military days. "Sometimes I wonder if things need to get worse before they can get better." Harrison studied my face carefully. "That's interesting, Mike. Because I know some people who think change might need a little push." Over the following months, I was gradually introduced to other members of their network. There was Tommy Walsh, a former Marine explosives expert who'd been radicalized after losing his job at a defense contractor. Sarah Kim, a discharged Navy intelligence specialist who believed the government was systematically targeting veterans. David Martinez, an ex-Air Force pilot whose conspiracy theories grew more elaborate each time we met. What struck me most was how normal they seemed in casual conversation. These weren't the stereotypical extremists portrayed in media coverage. They were educated, articulate people who'd served their country honorably before becoming convinced that the system they'd once protected was now their enemy. The cognitive dissonance was challenging. Part of my job required empathizing with their grievances enough to gain their trust, while simultaneously gathering intelligence that would lead to their arrest. I found myself genuinely understanding their frustrations, even as I documented their progression toward violence. The breakthrough came during my 6th month undercover. Harrison invited me to a weekend retreat in the Cascade Mountains, where the core group would discuss next steps in their resistance activities. The location was a remote cabin owned by Marcus Chen, a wealthy tech entrepreneur who funded their operations while maintaining distance from day-to-day activities. "This is where we separate the talkers from the doers," Harrison told me as we drove into the mountains. "We've been planning something big, something that'll wake people up to what's really happening in this country." The weekend revealed the full scope of their operation. They'd been surveilling federal buildings, identifying security vulnerabilities, and acquiring materials for what they called demonstration actions, but what any reasonable person would recognize as terrorist attacks. Walsh had been building improvised explosive devices using knowledge from his military training. Kim had been using her intelligence background to gather information about federal employee schedules and security protocols. Martinez had been scouting potential targets from his private aircraft, photographing federal installations under the guise of recreational flying. Their plan involved simultaneous attacks on 3 federal buildings during business hours, designed to maximize casualties and media coverage. They believed the attacks would trigger a broader uprising among disaffected Americans, leading to the collapse of what they saw as an illegitimate government. The beauty of the plan, Chen explained during a presentation that felt disturbingly professional, is that we're using their own tactics against them. Quick, coordinated strikes that demonstrate our capability while making a clear political statement. I sat in that cabin, surrounded by American veterans planning to murder their fellow citizens, and maintained the expression of someone excited about the prospect. Inside, I was calculating how many innocent people would die if this operation succeeded, how many families would be destroyed, how many communities would be traumatized. But I also had to admire their operational security and planning sophistication. These weren't amateur anarchists throwing together a desperate scheme. They'd spent months developing detailed intelligence, backup plans, and communication protocols that demonstrated genuine expertise. My handler Martinez had prepared me for this moment. When you identify imminent threat activity, document everything but don't try to interfere directly. Your role is intelligence gathering, not law enforcement. We have other assets who will handle interdiction. The challenge was maintaining my cover while ensuring the intelligence got to operational units quickly enough to prevent the attacks. The timeline they'd established left only 2 weeks for law enforcement to identify all participants, locate their weapon caches, and coordinate arrests across multiple jurisdictions. Over the following days, I photographed documents, memorized personal details, and identified connections to other extremist groups that hadn't previously been on law enforcement radar. The network was larger and more sophisticated than anyone had realized, with cells operating in at least 6 different states. But the most disturbing discovery was how easily I'd been accepted into their group. My cover identity was solid, but not perfect. A truly professional security screening should have identified inconsistencies in my background story. The fact that they'd welcomed me so readily suggested either dangerous operational security weaknesses or the possibility that they knew exactly who I was and were feeding me false information. The paranoia that came with deep cover work began affecting my judgment. Every casual comment felt like a test. Every friendly gesture seemed potentially manipulative. I started second-guessing conversations from weeks earlier, wondering if seemingly innocent questions had been attempts to verify details of my fabricated identity. Agent Martinez noticed the strain during our next meeting. "You're showing signs of operational stress. That's normal at this stage of a long-term assignment, but we need to address it before it affects your fornin." "I'm fine," I insisted, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. "Thompson, you've been living a lie for 6 months. That takes a psychological toll on everyone. The key is remembering who you really are, underneath the cover identity." But that was exactly the problem. After months of being Michael Stevens, I wasn't entirely sure who Daniel Thompson was anymore. The quiet, uncertain young man from Cedar Rapids felt like a character from someone else's story. The confident intelligence professional seemed equally foreign. Michael Stevens, ironically, felt most real because I'd been practicing his personality every day for half a year. The identity crisis deepened when I received word that Marcus had been promoted again, this time to lieutenant in charge of his department's major crimes unit. Our parents sent a care package with newspaper clippings about his latest cases and his growing reputation as a rising star in Iowa law enforcement. Reading about my brother's public achievements while secretly preparing to prevent a domestic terror attack created a surreal cognitive disconnect. Marcus was earning recognition for conventional police work while I was operating in the shadows, protecting people who would never know their lives had been threatened. The contrast crystallized everything I'd given up for this career path. Marcus had recognition, family support, and a clear identity rooted in his community. I had classified achievements, enforced isolation, and an identity that shifted depending on operational requirements. Yet, I also had the satisfaction of work that mattered on a scale Marcus couldn't imagine. The intelligence I was gathering would save hundreds of lives and prevent attacks that could have triggered broader social unrest. My anonymity was the price of impact that extended far beyond any individual recognition. As I prepared for the final phase of the operation, I realized that the choice between Marcus's path and mine wasn't really a choice at all. We were both serving our communities, just at different scales and with different levels of visibility. The tragedy was that neither of us could fully appreciate what the other had accomplished. The operation unraveled in ways no one had anticipated. 3 days before the planned arrests, Sarah Kim disappeared. Her apartment was cleaned out, her phone disconnected, and her vehicle found abandoned in a Seattle airport parking garage. Either she'd detected surveillance and fled, or someone had eliminated a potential security risk. Harrison called an emergency meeting at a warehouse in the industrial district. The remaining cell members were agitated, suspicious, and increasingly paranoid about infiltration. Tommy Walsh had armed himself and was openly discussing the possibility that one of their own was working with federal authorities. "Someone's been talking," he announced, pacing around the concrete space like a caged animal. "Kim doesn't just vanish without warning unless she knows something we don't." My training kicked in as I maintained Michael Stevens's concerned but confused expression while calculating escape routes and assessing threats. Walsh was carrying a Glock openly. Chen had what looked like a knife clipped to his belt, and Martinez kept checking his phone with the nervous energy of someone expecting bad news. "Maybe she got cold feet," I suggested, playing the role of someone trying to de-escalate tensions. "This is serious stuff we're talking about. Not everyone can handle that kind of pressure." Walsh spun toward me with eyes that had moved past rational discussion. Or maybe someone convinced her to disappear before she could implicate the rest of us. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an electrical fire. I could feel the group dynamics shifting, suspicion spreading like infection through their operational security protocols. These were trained military veterans who understood the signs of compromised operations, and they were starting to see those signs everywhere. Harrison tried to regain control of the situation. "We need to stick to the timeline. If Kim compromised anything, changing our plans now just gives them more time to prepare countermeasures. Or maybe we abort and live to fight another day," Chen countered. "My money's funding this operation, and I'm not comfortable with the current risk level." The debate continued for 2 hours, and I realized I was watching the operation collapse in real time. Without Kim's intelligence expertise, they couldn't properly assess federal building security. Without Chen's financial backing, they couldn't acquire the remaining materials they needed. Without group cohesion, they couldn't execute coordinated attacks. But the most dangerous outcome was that they might fragment into smaller, less predictable cells. A coordinated attack against known targets was something law enforcement could interdict. Random acts of violence by paranoid individuals operating alone would be nearly impossible to prevent. My secure phone vibrated with a text message that appeared to be spam, but contained coded instructions. "Exfiltration available if operation compromised. Respond within 2 hours." Agent Martinez was offering me an escape route, probably because intelligence indicated the cell was becoming too unstable to continue monitoring safely. But leaving now meant losing visibility into whatever came next. Walsh and Martinez were still committed to violence, even if their original plan was falling apart. I sent back the coded response indicating I would maintain position for another 48 hours. It was a calculated risk that could end my career or my life if the situation deteriorated further. The next day brought news that changed everything. Marcus Chen was found dead in his technology company's parking garage, apparently the victim of a robbery gone wrong. His wallet was missing, his expensive watch had been taken, and security cameras had conveniently malfunctioned during the time window when the attack occurred. But Chan's death didn't feel like a random crime. The timing was too convenient, the execution too clean. Someone had eliminated a loose end, and the remaining cell members understood the implications immediately. "We're all dead if we stay together," Walsh announced during a hurried meeting, at a different location. "Whoever killed Chen knows who we are and where to find us."
Harrison disagreed.
"Chan's death proves we're on the right track. They're getting desperate, taking risks to silence us. That means we're closer to success than we realized." The split became irreversible. Walsh and Martinez decided to disappear, abandoning the coordinated attack plan in favor of personal survival. Harrison remained committed to some form of action, though his resources and capabilities were now severely limited. I found myself in an impossible position. Following Walsh and Martinez might prevent individual attacks, but would mean losing oversight of Harrison's activities. Staying with Harrison meant better intelligence, but higher personal risk as the cell contracted around remaining members. The decision was made for me when Harrison pulled me aside after the others left. "Mike, I need to know if I can trust you completely. What we're planning next requires absolute commitment. No hesitation, no second thoughts." "You can count on me," I replied, though every instinct was screaming warnings about where this conversation was headed. "Good, because Chen's death changed our operational requirements. We're not talking about symbolic attacks anymore. We're talking about targeted elimination of specific federal agents who've been hunting our people." The mission had transformed from preventing terrorist attacks to preventing assassinations of federal law enforcement officers. Harrison had access to classified target lists that Kim had compiled before her disappearance, including names, addresses, and personal security details of agents working domestic terrorism cases. "The beauty of this approach," Harrison explained with the calm professionalism of someone discussing legitimate military tactics, "is that it sends a clear message while eliminating people who pose direct threats to our operational security." I realized I was looking at a completely different type of enemy than I'd been trained to handle. This wasn't ideological extremism or political terrorism. This was personal warfare against specific individuals who dedicated their careers to protecting national security. The target list included Agent Martinez. That night, I sat in my sparse apartment staring at encrypted communications that could save my handler's life while potentially exposing my own identity to a man who'd already demonstrated willingness to kill federal agents. The operational mathematics were stark, revealing what I knew would almost certainly blow my cover, but remaining silent might result in Martinez's death. I spent hours weighing options that felt equally impossible. Warn Martinez and lose years of deep cover development. Stay silent and risk losing the agent who'd guided me through the most challenging assignment of my career. Try to sabotage Harrison's operation from within, and risk exposure that could endanger other ongoing operations. At 3 in the morning, I made the decision that would define the rest of my career. I sent a coded message to Martinez, warning of imminent threat while providing enough operational detail to enable protective countermeasures. Then I destroyed my secure phone and prepared for the possibility that my cover identity was about to become irrelevant. The response came. 18 hours later, Harrison was arrested during what appeared to be a routine traffic stop, though I knew federal agents had been tracking his movements since receiving my warning. The arrest was clean, professional, and gave no indication that inside intelligence had been involved. But Harrison was experienced enough to recognize the timing and precision of his capture. During his one permitted phone call, he contacted a number that would have reached me if I'd still been maintaining my cover identity. Instead, the number now connected to a disconnected message service, another sign that Michael Stevens had outlived his usefulness. 3 days later, I was extracted from Seattle and debriefed at a secure facility outside Washington, D.C. The operation was classified as a complete success, terrorist attacks prevented, network disrupted, key players in custody, and valuable intelligence gathered about domestic extremist recruitment and funding methods. Colonel Fletcher personally conducted my debrief, and his assessment would determine my next assignment within the special operations community. Thompson, you demonstrated exceptional judgment under extreme pressure. Your decision to warn Agent Martinez potentially saved her life while preserving the integrity of ongoing operations. However, your cover identity is now burned, and your face is known to extremist networks. The implications were clear. Deep cover work was no longer an option for me. I'd have to transition to different types of intelligence operations, probably in analytical or leadership roles that didn't require assuming false identities. Your next assignment will be with Joint Special Operations Command Headquarters, working strategic intelligence for counter-terrorism operations worldwide. It's a promotion, Thompson, though it may not feel like one initially. As I prepared to leave Seattle forever, cleaning out Michael Stevens's apartment and erasing the last traces of an identity that had become more real to me than my actual life, I received word that Marcus had been selected for a special FBI Joint Task Force assignment. He'd been chosen to work on federal cases that required local law enforcement expertise. The irony was perfect. My brother was moving into federal law enforcement at exactly the moment I was transitioning away from field operations. We were both advancing in our careers, both serving our country, both protecting our communities, but neither of us had any idea what the other was actually doing. That separation would continue for another 2 years, until circumstances brought us together in a Pentagon briefing room, where Marcus would finally learn exactly who his pathetic little brother had become. Working at Joint Special Operations Command Headquarters felt like stepping into the nerve center of American counterterrorism operations. The Pentagon's classified levels housed analysis centers where intelligence from around the globe converged into actionable operations that most people would never hear about. My new position as Senior Intelligence Analyst for Strategic Operations put me at the intersection of tactical intelligence and strategic planning. Every morning, I briefed senior military officials on threats ranging from international terrorist networks to emerging cyber warfare capabilities. The decisions made in those briefings affected operations on 6 continents. Lieutenant Colonel Amanda Foster became my immediate supervisor, a career intelligence officer who'd worked her way up through assignments in Afghanistan, Syria, and counterintelligence operations against foreign adversaries. She'd been tracking my career since the Seattle operation and had specifically requested my assignment to her unit. "Thompson, your field experience gives you perspective that most analysts lack," she explained during my first week. "You understand how intelligence translates to operational reality because you've lived that translation. I need someone who can brief operators in language they understand while providing strategic context for policymakers." The work was intellectually demanding in ways that stretched beyond anything I'd experienced. Instead of focusing on single operations or limited geographic areas, I was analyzing global patterns, predicting emerging threats, and coordinating intelligence sharing between agencies that often competed for resources and recognition. My first major assignment involved developing threat assessments for a joint operation targeting international arms dealers who were supplying weapons to terrorist organizations across 3 continents. The network included former military officers from Eastern Europe, criminal organizations in South America, and radical groups in North Africa and the Middle East. The complexity required synthesizing intelligence from human sources, electronic surveillance, financial investigations, and diplomatic channels. I spent weeks building link analyses that mapped relationships between individuals who'd never met, but whose activities supported the same ultimate objectives. The breakthrough came when I identified a pattern in shipping manifests that revealed how the network was using legitimate commercial transactions to mask weapons transfers. By analyzing cargo weights, shipping routes, and customs documentation across multiple countries, I discovered that they were hiding military equipment inside industrial machinery shipments. My analysis enabled a coordinated operation involving American Special Operations Forces, European law enforcement, and Allied intelligence services. The simultaneous raids disrupted weapon shipments worth over $50 million and led to arrests in 7 countries. General Patricia Hayes, JSOC's deputy commander, personally reviewed my work and included my findings in briefings to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and National Security Council. For the first time in my career, my analysis was directly influencing decisions made at the highest levels of government. "Thompson," General Hayes said during a corridor conversation that felt more significant than formal performance reviews, "you have an unusual ability to see strategic implications in tactical intelligence. That's a rare skill, and one we need more of in senior analytical positions." The comment was professional recognition of the highest order, but it also highlighted the growing distance between my experiences and anything my family could understand. How could I explain to my parents that their quiet son was briefing generals and influencing national security policy? How could I describe work that was classified at levels requiring security clearances they'd never heard of? Meanwhile, Marcus's career continued advancing through more conventional channels. Through carefully worded phone calls home, I learned he'd been promoted to detective captain and was leading multi-jurisdictional investigations that earned regular media coverage. Local newspapers featured articles about his successful cases, and he'd been invited to speak at law enforcement conferences about innovative investigative techniques. During one of our rare phone conversations, Marcus seemed genuinely interested in my military career for the first time in years. "So, Daniel, you're still doing intelligence work? That must be interesting, getting to see classified information and all that." "It has its moments," I replied, choosing words that wouldn't reveal anything while acknowledging his interest. "Jennifer's been asking about your work. She thinks it's cool that you're like a spy or something." The comment was meant as friendly teasing, but it reflected how civilians romanticized intelligence work without understanding its actual demands. Marcus saw my career as some kind of adventure story, not as the careful, methodical analysis that actually protected people from threats they'd never know existed. "It's mostly analytical work," I said. "A lot of reading reports and writing assessments. Still, it beats regular Army duty, right? Climate-controlled offices, regular hours, no physical demands." His assumptions revealed how completely he misunderstood what I was doing. The work required constant mental pressure, irregular schedules, and decision-making responsibilities that affected operations where people died if the analysis was wrong. But I couldn't explain any of that without discussing classified information. The conversation reminded me how isolated my career path had become. Success in intelligence work was measured by operations that succeeded, attacks that were prevented, and threats that were neutralized before they became public knowledge. My most significant achievements would never be recognized publicly, and my failures could have catastrophic consequences that I'd carry privately forever. 6 months into my Pentagon assignment, I was selected for the Advanced Strategic Intelligence course, a program that prepared officers for senior leadership positions within the intelligence community. The selection was competitive, limited to 12 officers annually, and indicated that the military was investing in my long-term potential for senior command positions. The course took place at the National Defense University, where I studied alongside officers from different branches and civilian agencies. We analyzed case studies of successful and failed intelligence operations, studied the intersection of intelligence and policy, and participated in simulations that tested our ability to manage complex multi-agency operations. More importantly, the course introduced me to the broader intelligence community leadership structure. I met CIA section chiefs, NSA division heads, and FBI assistant directors who managed operations I'd only heard about in classified briefings. These were the people who made decisions about America's most sensitive national security operations. During a particularly challenging exercise, we were tasked with developing response plans for a simulated cyber attack that threatened critical infrastructure across multiple states. The scenario required coordinating responses between military cyber command, civilian law enforcement, private sector partners, and state government agencies. My approach focused on identifying the attack's strategic objectives rather than just responding to tactical symptoms. By analyzing the pattern of targeted systems, I determined that the attackers were trying to disrupt specific economic sectors that would create maximum psychological impact while demonstrating capability for more devastating follow-up attacks. The solution I proposed involved deliberately allowing certain non-critical attacks to succeed while protecting high-value targets and using the attacker's methods to trace their command structure. It was a counterintuitive strategy that required accepting short-term damage to achieve long-term security objectives. Dr. Michael Chen, the civilian instructor leading the exercise, was impressed enough to use my approach as a case study for future classes. "Thompson, you think like a strategist rather than just an analyst. You understand that intelligence work isn't just about gathering information. It's about understanding adversary intentions and disrupting their decision-making processes." The recognition felt validating, but it also emphasized how far I'd traveled from the uncertain young man who'd enlisted to prove himself worthy of his brother's respect. The person I'd become could brief cabinet members, design complex operations, and influence decisions that affected global security. But that same person couldn't share his achievements with the family whose approval had once seemed so important. The final phase of the course involved individual projects where each officer developed comprehensive strategic assessments on assigned topics. My project analyzed emerging threats from domestic extremist networks and their potential connections to foreign adversaries. The research built on my experiences from the Seattle operation, but approached domestic terrorism from a strategic rather than tactical perspective. I examined how foreign intelligence services were exploiting American social divisions, how extremist recruitment had evolved with social media platforms, and how domestic threats were becoming more sophisticated in their operational security. My assessment included recommendations for new analytical approaches, improved interagency coordination, and policy changes that could reduce vulnerabilities without compromising civil liberties. The final report was classified at the highest levels and distributed to senior leadership across the intelligence community. General Hayes personally reviewed the assessment and called me to her office for a private meeting. "Thompson, this analysis demonstrates strategic thinking at a level we typically see from much more senior officers. Based on this work and your overall performance, I'm recommending you for accelerated promotion and assignment to a position that will put you in direct contact with the most sensitive operations we conduct." The opportunity she described would make me one of the youngest officers ever assigned to brief the National Security Council on active operations. It represented the kind of career advancement that most intelligence officers spent decades trying to achieve. But it also meant accepting even greater isolation from normal civilian life, including the family relationships that had once defined my sense of identity. The higher I rose in the classified world, the more impossible it became to bridge the gap between my professional achievements and my personal connections. As I prepared for the next phase of my career, I had no idea that circumstances were about to bring me face to face with Marcus in a context that would finally reveal exactly who I'd become. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing intelligence reports about a developing situation in Eastern Europe. General Hayes's aide requested my immediate presence in Conference Room Delta 7, the Pentagon's most secure briefing facility, for an emergency interagency coordination meeting. "Sir, what's the nature of the emergency?" I asked, already gathering my classified materials. "Domestic terrorism threat with potential federal law enforcement casualties. Multiple agencies are involved, and you're the primary intelligence briefer." Conference Room Delta 7 was where the most sensitive operations were planned and coordinated. The walls were lined with screens displaying classified information, and the security protocols required multiple levels of clearance verification just to enter. As senior intelligence analyst for strategic operations, I'd briefed this room dozens of times, but never with such short notice or urgency. I arrived 10 minutes early to review the situation reports and prepare my briefing materials. The threat involved a sophisticated domestic terrorist cell that had acquired detailed intelligence about federal agents working counter-terrorism cases. Unlike the Seattle operation I'd worked years earlier, this group had connections to foreign intelligence services and access to military-grade equipment. The intelligence was disturbing. They identified specific agents by name, documented their home addresses and family information, and developed detailed plans for coordinated assassinations designed to cripple federal law enforcement's domestic terrorism capabilities. The operation would begin within 72 hours unless law enforcement could identify and neutralize the threat. As other attendees began arriving, I recognized the familiar faces of senior FBI, CIA, and NSA officials who regularly participated in these high-level coordination meetings. What I didn't expect was to see local law enforcement representatives being escorted into the most classified briefing room in the Pentagon. The first person through the door was Assistant Director Rebecca Morrison from the FBI's Counterterrorism Division, followed by CIA Section Chief Robert Kim and NSA Deputy Director Jennifer Walsh. Behind them came three individuals I didn't immediately recognize, local law enforcement officers who'd apparently been granted temporary security clearances for this specific briefing. The third person through the door was my brother Marcus. He wore a crisp suit instead of his usual police uniform, carried himself with the confidence of someone comfortable in professional settings, and showed no signs of being intimidated by the Pentagon's overwhelming security apparatus. When he saw me sitting at the briefing table, his expression shifted through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been respect. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hayes announced as she entered the room, "thank you for responding quickly to this emergency coordination meeting. The situation we're facing requires unprecedented cooperation between federal agencies and local law enforcement. Some of you may be wondering why local officers have been brought into a classified federal briefing. The answer is that this terrorist cell has specifically targeted agents who work joint task force operations. And we need the expertise of officers who understand both federal and local investigative methods." She gestured toward the three local law enforcement representatives. Detective Captain Marcus Thompson from Cedar Rapids Police Department has been leading a joint FBI task force investigation that uncovered intelligence critical to preventing these planned assassinations. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez from Miami-Dade has been tracking financial networks used by domestic extremist groups. Detective Sergeant Michael Chen from Seattle PD provided the initial intelligence that revealed the scope of this threat. Marcus's eyes remained fixed on me as General Hayes continued the introductions. I could see him processing the implications of my presence in this room, at this table, briefing these people about threats he'd never imagined existed. Our primary intelligence briefer for this operation is Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Thompson, Senior Intelligence Analyst for Strategic Operations. General Hayes paused, and I saw her register the identical surnames. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson has been tracking domestic extremist networks for several years and recently identified the foreign intelligence connections that make this threat particularly dangerous. The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder. Marcus stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not dismissal or condescension, but genuine shock mixed with something that might have been awe. I stood to begin my briefing, meeting my brother's eyes directly for the first time in years, without feeling like I needed to justify my choices or apologize for my path. The terrorist network we're dealing with represents a new evolution in domestic extremism, I began, activating the room's display screens to show intelligence summaries and operational charts. Unlike previous cells that operated independently, this group has received training, funding, and intelligence support from foreign adversaries who want to destabilize American law enforcement capabilities. The briefing continued for 40 minutes, as I detailed the threat's scope, the specific agents who'd been targeted, and the recommended countermeasures that would prevent the attacks while preserving ongoing operations. Marcus listened with the focused attention of someone trying to understand information that was completely outside his previous experience. "Detective Captain Thompson," I said, addressing my brother formally, "your task force investigation identified financial transactions that revealed how this network has been funded. Can you brief the group on those findings?" Marcus stood and delivered a professional summary of his investigation, describing banking records, suspicious transactions, and coordination with federal financial crimes units. His presentation was thorough, confident, and demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking that made him an effective detective. But as he spoke, I could see him glancing at the intelligence displays I'd prepared, trying to understand how his local investigation connected to the global threat patterns I'd been tracking. The scope of the briefing was clearly far beyond anything he'd previously been exposed to. After the formal briefing ended and operational assignments were distributed, General Hayes dismissed most attendees, but asked Marcus and me to remain behind. "I assume you two are related," she said with the directness of someone who didn't have time for family drama during national security crises. "Yes, ma'am," I replied. "Marcus is my older brother." She looked between us, clearly calculating whether family relationships would complicate the operation. "Detective Captain Thompson, your brother has been working these types of threats for several years. His analysis directly contributed to preventing terrorist attacks that would have killed hundreds of people. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, your brother's local law enforcement expertise identified connections our federal analysts missed. This operation succeeded because both of your contributions were essential." Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before. "Daniel, I had no idea. When you said you were doing intelligence work, you thought I was pushing papers in some office somewhere," I finished. "Yeah, something like that." He looked around the briefing room, taking in the classified displays and secure communication equipment. "This is what you've been doing? Briefing generals and preventing terrorist attacks?" Among other things, General Hayes interrupted before the conversation could become too personal. "Gentlemen, you'll have time to discuss your careers later. Right now, we have 72 hours to prevent multiple assassinations. Detective Captain Thompson, you'll be working directly with Lieutenant Colonel Thompson's team to coordinate the law enforcement response. Your local expertise combined with his strategic intelligence will be essential for operational success." Over the next 3 days, Marcus and I worked together more closely than we had since childhood. He provided insights about local criminal networks and law enforcement procedures that helped federal agencies coordinate more effectively. I shared intelligence about the terrorists' foreign connections and strategic objectives that helped local officers understand the broader implications of their investigations. The operation was a complete success, coordinated arrests across 6 states, disrupted the network before any attacks could occur. The foreign intelligence agents who'd been supporting the group were identified and expelled. Most importantly, dozens of federal agents who'd been targeted for assassination continued their work protecting American communities. During the after-action briefing, Marcus sat quietly as General Hayes commended the interagency cooperation that made the operation possible. When she specifically mentioned my strategic analysis and his local law enforcement coordination, I saw something I'd never seen before in my brother's expression: genuine pride in my achievements. After the briefing ended and we were alone in the Pentagon parking garage, Marcus finally said what had been building between us for years. Daniel, I owe you an apology. A big one. Marcus, you don't need to. Yes, I do. He looked directly at me, and for the first time since we were children, I felt like he was really seeing me. I called you pathetic at my academy graduation. I thought you were wasting your potential, that you couldn't stick with anything long enough to succeed. I was wrong about everything. The admission hung between us like a bridge we'd both been afraid to cross. You weren't entirely wrong, I said. I was uncertain about a lot of things back then. But you figured it out. You found something worth committing to completely, and you became someone I couldn't have imagined. He gestured toward the Pentagon building behind us. Lieutenant Colonel, briefing generals, preventing terrorist attacks. That's not pathetic, Daniel. That's extraordinary. For years I'd imagined this moment, my brother finally understanding what I'd accomplished, finally seeing me as an equal rather than a younger sibling who needed guidance. But now that it was happening, I realized his opinion mattered less than I'd thought it would. Marcus, I didn't do this to prove anything to you. I did it because it was what I was meant to do. I know, and that's what makes it even more impressive. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Two brothers who'd taken different paths, but arrived at mutual respect for each other's choices. So what happens now? Marcus asked. Now we go back to our jobs. You continue being an excellent detective, and I continue doing work I can't talk about. Will I see you more often? Probably not. My work requires a certain level of separation from civilian life. But Marcus? I looked at my brother, this person who'd shaped so much of my early identity through his expectations and judgments. I'm proud of what you've built. Your career, your family, your reputation in the community. You chose a path that lets you help people while staying connected to the life we grew up in. That takes a different kind of courage than what I do. Marcus smiled, and for the first time in years it felt completely genuine. Maybe we both figured out who we were supposed to be. As we parted ways in that Pentagon parking garage, I realized that the boy who'd enlisted to earn his brother's approval was finally gone. What remained was a man who'd found his purpose in protecting people who would never know his name, in preventing disasters that would never make headlines, in serving his country through work that required complete anonymity. The metal on my chest felt warm now, not cold. Not because Marcus finally understood what I'd become, but because I'd finally stopped needing his understanding to know who I was. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't the one that gets recognized. Sometimes it's the one that happens in silence, in shadows, in briefing rooms where the most important work gets done by people whose names will never be known. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, your family gets to see who you really are, even if only for a moment. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.